Hey everyone, welcome into our latest TDR Cannabis in 5 presented by Dutchie. I'm your host, Shad Dales, and today we're talking about the American cannabis landscape and how it's back in the spotlight, something we haven't seen like this in a number of years, and it's nice to see. And it all came down to one comment. It was from President Donald Trump, who made an announcement at a press conference earlier this week about the timeline of a potential rescheduling of cannabis. And with that, it sent stocks soaring. So today I want to dive into our latest episode on what's happened, what the announcement meant for stocks, and what we can anticipate moving forward. But a quick reminder, this is purely educational and is not investment advice. So with that, let's get into today's episode. There's a lot of people wanting to know what's next on the equity side of this industry moving forward. So let's begin as to why this matters and why so many cannabis stocks moved earlier this week. To really understand why it hit so hard, you have to look at what Schedule 1 means. Cannabis has been sitting in the same legal category as heroin for decades, despite widespread medical and recreational legalization at the state level. And there's been a lot of rumors and buzz about reform for at least 5 to 6 years. So rescheduling to Schedule 3, it wouldn't make cannabis federally legal, but it would have major business implications. One of the biggest implications would be tax relief. Right now, because something called Section 280E of the tax code, cannabis businesses can't deduct more operating expenses. That's a huge burden on profitability. If cannabis moves to Schedule 3, 280E would no longer apply, giving operators more breathing room and potentially freeing up cash for expansion, hiring, and product development. That's why this matters so much to investors, and that's why the market reaction was so intense. So now when we look back as to what happened immediately after Trump's remarks, there was a lot. The MSOS ETF, the main exchange-traded fund that invests only in US-based cannabis companies, it surged about 25% in a single day. We saw more than $57 million in net inflows into MSOS over the past month, with 21 million of that coming in just the last 5 days. That is a flood of money. And it wasn't just the ETF. Individual MSO operators, or MSOs, they exploded higher. When we look at some of the biggest names, this is how they performed in recent days. Cresco Labs, after the announcement, it was up over 30%. Verano Holdings, it was up again over 30%. GTI was up 22%, and Truly, it surged 38% last week. It's now pausing as traders are looking at gains. Next up is Terracin. They showed strong double-digit gains. Curaleaf as well was up roughly 14% earlier this week, but keep in mind, this company has already rallied about a fourfold of its all-time lows earlier this year, with much of that move happening well before earnings. Even the legacy Canadian names that trade on the NASDAQ, they got a big lift. Tilray earlier this week was up over 40%. Canopy Growth showed a strong double-digit rally, as well as Village Farms. They also posted a double-digit gain. So this was a broad-based move, and it tells us one thing. Investors aren't just betting on a single company. They're betting on an entire sector that is waking up. And speaking of waking up, when we talk about the cannabis industry, we also have to talk about the companies that are working it and keeping it real behind the scenes. That's where our friends at Dutchie come in. This episode of the TDR Cannabis in 5 is brought to you by Dutchie, the all-in-one technology platform for cannabis retailers. They power everything from point of sale to e-commerce, helping dispensaries run smoother, faster, and smarter. So if you're in the cannabis business, you should be in business with Dutchie. To learn more on becoming a more efficient retail dispensary, visit business.dutchie.com. All right, let's now get back to the market, because the setup we're looking at right now, it could go in a few different directions. So keep in mind here, because this is where I'm going with this. So first up, here's what could happen next, because there's a few scenarios. Remember, this is not investment advice. This is just possibilities to watch. Scenario 1 is bullish momentum continues. Trump follows through quickly. He announces rescheduling, and the details are clean. No major carve-outs and no delays. That could attract more mainstream investors, not just retail investors, but potentially bigger funds looking for exposure. In that case, we could see MSOS continue attracting capital, and the top U.S. operators could keep climbing. Then you've got scenario 2, which is consolidation and volatility. This one's more common after big rallies. If there's no decision right away, or if the messaging stays vague, you might see stocks bounce around, some profit-taking, some sideways trading, as the market waits for more clarity, which makes sense as well. This is where fundamentals matter, whether companies can sustain investor confidence through operational performance while headlines continue to develop. Then you got scenario 3, which is the hype fading. It's possible rescheduling happens, but the benefits take longer to materialize, or there are restrictions that limit the immediate impact. If that then does happen, prices could retrace towards pre-announcement levels. We've seen this before. In 2018, we saw the Canadian legalization hype. Then in 2020, we saw the early U.S. reform headlines that clearly fizzled out in Congress, and that's where we are today. So the point is, the sentiment can turn very quickly in this space, which many of you who have been investing in this space for for quite some time are very familiar with. So now let's talk about fundamentals for a minute. The MSOS ETF isn't just moving because of charts, it's moving because of money flowing into the space. Over the past month, MSOS has seen more than $57 million in net inflows, with nearly $21 million coming in just the last 5 days. That tells us investors are actively positioning for a policy shift, and they want exposure to U.S. operators ahead of any official rescheduling decision. The bigger picture here is that the MSOS is a proxy for the American cannabis industry. When it attracts new capital, it's often because of institutions, family offices, and retail investors seeing a changing policy landscape. It's not just a trade. If that narrative stays intact and Washington follows through, those inflows could continue. But if expectations aren't met, that same money could exit just as quickly, which is why this remains a headline-driven market, something this industry really was born on. So when you look at all this, here's the bigger question. What does rescheduling really mean for the U.S. cannabis market? First, and it's important, it doesn't legalize cannabis federally. That would still require Congress. But it would be a huge step in the eyes of institutions, banks, and investors who have stayed away from the sector because of its Schedule I status. It would also open the door for, as we said, many new investors and a wave of M&A activity as bigger players position themselves ahead of further reform. And from a business perspective, removing 280E could be the difference between just surviving and actually growing. So as we bring this all together, here is the bottom line. Trump's comment earlier this week has given the U.S. cannabis market its biggest jolt in years, let's be honest. So whether this turns into a lasting run or just a short-term spike, it will depend on what happens in the next few weeks and how Wall Street reacts to every word out of Washington, because this is a Washington play. Cannabis reform has been delayed for a long time, and this pot has been boiling for quite some time, which is why any reform news that actually is signed into law will be a huge step forward for this industry. And really, this is what you're seeing with these stocks over these last couple of weeks. It's headline news, which we're all too familiar in this industry. It can work either for you or against you. What happens next? Well, we're about to find out in these next few weeks. Saying that, thanks for checking into our latest TDR Cannabis in 5, presented by Dutchie. I'm your host, Shad Dales. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everyone. Thanks again for watching.